In the mists of 6th century Britain, a tale began to weave itself into the very fabric of the land, one that would echo through centuries, the legend of King Arthur. This was a time when the Roman legions had long departed, leaving a power vacuum that fractured the island into a patchwork of warring kingdoms. The faint whispers of Latin still clung to the stones of abandoned villas, but the dominant tongues were the guttural Brythonic dialects, spoken by a people who looked to their own chieftains and their own gods, even as Christianity began its slow, inexorable creep across the landscape. The land itself, rugged and untamed, was a character in its own right. Ancient forests, shadowed hills, and rivers that flowed with the memories of forgotten battles. Our story, however, does not begin with Arthur himself, but with the tempestuous passions of his father, Uther Pendragon, a powerful warlord who, by many accounts, held sway over a significant portion of what we now call England. Uther was a man of fierce appetites and unyielding will, a leader whose very presence could command loyalty or incite fear. It was at a grand feast, celebrating a victory or perhaps a fragile truce, that his eyes first fell upon Igraine, the Duchess of Cornwall. She was, by all accounts, a woman of breathtaking beauty, her grace and bearing captivating Uther completely. The problem, a rather significant one, was that Igraine was already married to Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall, a formidable warrior and a man not easily crossed. Uther's desire for Igraine became an obsession, a fire that consumed his reason. He pressed his suit, openly, shamelessly, much to the scandal of his court and the fury of Gorlois. The Duke, a man of honour and pride, saw no recourse but to remove his wife from Uther's predatory gaze. He spirited Igraine away to his strongest fortress, Tintagel Castle. A formidable stronghold perched dramatically on a craggy headland overlooking the tumultuous sea. Its very architecture seemed to defy intrusion, a natural bastion against any aggressor. Gorlois then retreated to another of his castles, Terrabil, preparing for the inevitable conflict, for he knew Uther would not easily relinquish his prize. Uther, indeed, was enraged. His desire, now thwarted, festered into a burning wrath. He declared war on Gorlois, laying siege to Terrabil, but the Duke's defences were strong, and the siege dragged on. It was in this moment of frustrated longing and military stalemate that Uther turned to a figure shrouded in mystery and immense power, Merlin. Merlin, as the legends tell us, was more than just a sorcerer. He was a seer, a counsellor, a weaver of fates. His origins are debated by scholars to this day. Some suggest he was a druid, a remnant of an older, pagan spirituality, while others believe he was a Christian hermit with arcane knowledge, or perhaps even a being of Fey ancestry. Regardless of his true nature, his reputation for magic and prophecy was unparalleled. Uther, desperate, sought Merlin's aid. He demanded that Merlin use his magic to allow him access to Igraine. Merlin, ever the pragmatist, recognized the volatile nature of Uther's obsession and the potential for greater chaos if it remained unchecked. He agreed to Uther's plea, but not without exacting a heavy price. The condition was stark. If Merlin were to make it possible for Uther to lie with Igraine, the resulting child, if male, would be given to Merlin immediately upon birth, to be raised in secret, far from the intrigues of court. Uther, blinded by his lust, readily agreed, perhaps not fully grasping the profound implications of such a bargain. Merlin, with his potent enchantments, transformed Uther's appearance. He made the king look exactly like Gorlois, complete with his mannerisms and voice. Under the cloak of night, Uther, disguised as Igraine's husband, was able to enter Tintagel Castle undetected. The guards, recognizing their lord, offered no resistance. Igraine, believing it was her husband returned from battle, welcomed him into her chambers. That night, King Arthur was conceived. The deception was complete, and the seed of a future king was sown in an act of profound trickery and passion. Meanwhile, a short distance away, the real Gorlois, still besieged at Terrabil, made a desperate sally against Uther's forces, perhaps hoping to break the siege or at least inflict significant damage. In the ensuing skirmish, Gorlois was killed. The news of his death reached Tintagel the very next morning, almost simultaneously with the revelation of Uther's deception. Igraine, now a widow, was faced with a bewildering truth. Her husband was dead, and the man who had lain with her the night before was Uther Pendragon, her husband's killer and now her king. The emotional turmoil must have been immense, a whirlwind of grief, betrayal, and the dawning realization of her own unwitting complicity. Uther, having achieved his immediate goal, wasted no time. He married Igraine, consolidating his power and legitimizing his claim to Cornwall. The union was perhaps one of convenience and conquest, as much as it was of passion, though the legends suggest a genuine affection grew between them over time. 9 months later, a son was born, a healthy boy destined for greatness. True to his word, or perhaps compelled by Merlin's unyielding will, Uther surrendered the infant to the sorcerer. Merlin, recognizing the child's immense potential and the dangers that would surround him if his royal lineage were known, immediately took the babe away. He entrusted the infant to Sir Ector, a loyal and honourable knight of lesser standing, who lived in a secluded manor far from the political machinations of the court. Sir Ector and his wife raised the boy, whom they named Arthur, as their own, alongside their biological son, Kay. Arthur grew up believing he was Sir Ector's natural son, a simple country boy, albeit one with an innate nobility and an unusual strength of character that set him apart. This hidden upbringing was crucial. It protected Arthur from the jealousies and dangers that would surely have befallen a known royal heir in such tumultuous times. The various warlords and petty kings who constantly vied for power would have seen a young prince as either a threat to be eliminated or a pawn to be manipulated. By removing him from this environment, Merlin ensured Arthur's survival and allowed him to develop a strong moral compass, uncorrupted by the decadence and cunning often found in royal courts. He learned the ways of the sword and the saddle from Sir Ector, and the principles of chivalry and justice from the knight's quiet example. Historians still debate the precise location of Tintagel Castle and its historical significance. While the dramatic ruins we see today date largely from the 13th century, archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of a high-status settlement on the site dating back to the 5th and 6th centuries, precisely the period in which Arthur is traditionally placed. This includes fragments of imported pottery from the Mediterranean, suggesting a wealthy and well-connected community capable of supporting a powerful chieftain like Gorlois. This archaeological evidence lends a tangible, if still elusive, grounding to the legendary setting of Arthur's conception. The concept of a powerful, enigmatic figure like Merlin guiding the destiny of a king is a recurring motif in many ancient cultures, reflecting a human desire to believe in forces beyond the mundane. Merlin, with his deep knowledge of the land, its ancient lore, and the movements of the stars, embodies this archetypal wise man. His role in Arthur's early life was not merely one of protection, but of shaping. He instilled in Arthur, through his surrogate parents, a sense of justice, compassion, and leadership that would prove vital in the years to come. The boy, unaware of his true parentage, was being forged in the crucible of anonymity, preparing him for a destiny he could not yet comprehend. During these formative years, Arthur would have experienced the rhythms of rural life, the changing seasons, the challenges of farming, and the camaraderie of a knight's household. He would have learned to ride, to hunt, and to handle a sword and shield, not as a prince in training, but as a young man expected to contribute to his household and defend its interests. This grounded upbringing, far from the gilded cages of royalty, likely fostered a deep connection to the common people and a practical understanding of their struggles, qualities that would later define his reign. The exact details of Uther Pendragon's reign are also shrouded in the mists of time, with historical records from this period being notoriously scarce and often contradictory. What little we know suggests a period of intense conflict and shifting alliances among the various Brythonic kingdoms, constantly under threat from invading Saxon tribes from the east. Uther's title, Pendragon, itself is significant. It literally means chief dragon or head warlord, suggesting a leader who commanded respect and authority over other lesser kings. This was not a unified kingdom in the modern sense, but rather a confederation of tribes and warlords, united, however loosely, under a powerful figure like Uther. It was into this fractured and dangerous world that Arthur was born, a world where might often made right, and where the concept of a unified, just kingdom seemed a distant dream. His hidden youth, therefore, was not just a protective measure, but a period of incubation, allowing the seeds of his future greatness to germinate in obscurity. The mystery surrounding his birth and early life only added to the mystique that would later define him, setting him apart as a figure touched by destiny. The quiet years at Sir Ector's manor, filled with the simple joys of childhood and the rigorous training of a young squire, were the calm before the storm, the foundation upon which a legendary reign would be built. The stage was set, not with fanfares and royal decrees, but with a whispered promise and a hidden child, waiting for the moment when fate would call him forth. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The air hung heavy with a silence born of disbelief, a collective gasp swallowed by the vast, echoing space of the cathedral courtyard. All eyes, moments before filled with a restless impatience, now fixed on the slender youth standing beside the stone. The sword, that gleaming, impossible blade, was no longer merely resting within its ancient prison. It was held, firmly and undeniably, in Arthur's hand. A hush fell, deeper than any sermon, as the boy, barely a man, stood bathed in the pale winter light, the sword's polished surface reflecting the awe and confusion on the faces of the assembled lords. This was no mere trick, no sleight of hand. The challenge had been clear, the attempts numerous, and the failures absolute. Night after night, their faces etched with determination and then frustration, had strained against the stone, their muscles rippling under heavy tunics, only to be defeated. Their armor, once gleaming symbols of power, had seemed to mock their efforts as they grunted and sweated, unable to stir the blade even a fraction of an inch. And now, this boy, this unknown, had drawn it forth with a grace that seemed almost effortless. The sword itself was a marvel. Its hilt was intricately wrought, perhaps with symbols of forgotten kings or ancient magic, and the blade, though ancient, shone with a light that seemed to emanate from within. It felt cool and balanced in Arthur's grip, a natural extension of his arm, as if it had always been meant for him. A strange warmth spread through him, a sense of destiny awakening. But the silence did not last. A murmur began, a low hum of voices that quickly escalated into a clamour. "Impossible!" one lord boomed, his voice thick with indignation. "A trick! This boy is no king!" Another, younger and more ambitious, pushed forward, demanding, "Let me try! He must have loosened it somehow!" Sir Ector, his face a mixture of shock and dawning understanding, stepped forward, his hand resting protectively on Arthur's shoulder. "He drew it fairly," he stated, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "We all witnessed it." But his words were drowned out by the rising tide of protest. The lords, proud and powerful men who had long vied for the vacant throne, were not prepared to accept a mere boy, a squire, as their sovereign. Their pride, their ambition, and their deeply ingrained sense of hierarchy rebelled against such an unthinkable turn of events. The drawing of the sword, while a clear sign to some, was not the undisputed coronation Arthur might have hoped for. The concept of a divinely chosen king, while present in some ancient traditions, often clashed with the very real political machinations and power struggles of the time. The transition of power in early medieval societies was rarely smooth, often involving intricate alliances, betrayals, and even open warfare. For instance, the succession struggles following the death of Charlemagne in 814 CE, though centuries later, illustrate the intense competition among powerful nobles and heirs, often leading to protracted conflicts rather than peaceful acceptance of a single, divinely appointed ruler. The idea of a king emerging from obscurity without a lineage of power and wealth would have been anathema to these powerful landholders. Merlin, however, observed the chaos with a calm, almost knowing smile. He had foreseen this moment, though perhaps not the exact nature of the Lord's resistance. He knew that the true test of kingship lay not in the drawing of a magical sword, but in the ability to unite a fractured kingdom. He stepped forward, his staff tapping rhythmically on the stone, and his voice, though not loud, cut through the din. "The prophecy is fulfilled," he declared, his eyes burning with an ancient wisdom. "The one who draws the sword is the rightful king. The land cries out for a ruler, for unity, for peace." His words, while carrying weight for some, were met with skepticism by others. Many lords, raw faces hardened by years of battle and political maneuvering, scoffed. They demanded proof, not just of the sword's miraculous extraction, but of Arthur's lineage. For them, bloodline and noble birth were paramount. How could a boy, raised in the humble household of Sir Ector, possess the royal blood necessary to rule? The truth, known only to Merlin and a select few, was a closely guarded secret. Arthur was indeed of royal blood. The son of the late King Uther Pendragon and Queen Igraine, spirited away at birth by Merlin to protect him from the chaos and dangers that followed Uther's death. This was a common practice in times of political instability, where a child heir might be hidden away until they were old enough or the political climate was more favourable. The story of Cyrus the Great, for instance, being hidden from his grandfather Astyages due to a prophetic dream, shows a similar theme of a royal child being raised in obscurity to protect them from perceived threats. To appease the dissenting lords, and to provide further undeniable proof, Merlin orchestrated a series of trials. The sword was reinserted into the stone, and again, the knights, one by one, attempted to draw it, each failing as before. And each time, Arthur, with quiet dignity, stepped forward and effortlessly withdrew the blade. This repeated demonstration, witnessed by an ever-growing crowd, slowly began to chip away at the most stubborn resistance. Some, seeing the undeniable magic at play, began to whisper of divine favor. Others, pragmatic and weary of the endless feuds, started to consider the possibility that this boy, however unlikely, might be their best hope for peace. Yet even with these repeated proofs, the early days of Arthur's reign were far from stable. Accustomed to their own autonomy and influence, resented the idea of submitting to a young, unproven king. They saw him as an upstart, a threat to their established power. Historians still debate the exact nature of these early challenges. Was it a coordinated rebellion, a series of isolated skirmishes, or more of a simmering discontent that manifested in various acts of defiance and refusal to acknowledge his authority? The sources, often written much later and imbued with legendary elements, offer tantalizing glimpses, but rarely a clear, unified picture. One lesser-known detail from this period suggests that some lords, rather than outright rebellion, simply refused to attend Arthur's initial councils, effectively boycotting his attempts to establish a central government. This passive resistance, while not as dramatic as open warfare, could be just as debilitating for a fledgling monarch, preventing the collection of taxes, the raising of armies, and the enforcement of laws. Imagine the young king sitting in a sparsely attended hall, trying to govern a kingdom where half his vassals simply ignored his summons. Arthur, guided by Merlin's wisdom, understood that he could not rule by divine right alone. He needed to earn the loyalty and respect of his people, particularly the powerful nobles. His early reign was characterized by a delicate balance of diplomacy, firmness, and strategic displays of both strength and mercy. He began to tour his kingdom, visiting various strongholds, listening to grievances, and demonstrating his commitment to justice. He understood that a king's authority was not just granted, but also earned through consistent action. He also began to gather around him a core group of loyal knights, men who had witnessed the miracle of the sword and believed in his destiny. These were not necessarily the most powerful lords, but often younger, more idealistic knights, or those from less prominent families who saw an opportunity for advancement under a new, just king. These early companions would form the nucleus of what would eventually become the Knights of the Round Table, a symbol of unity and chivalry. One of the most significant challenges Arthur faced was the need to establish a clear legal framework and a system of justice. The years of interregnum had led to a breakdown of law and order. Local lords often acted as judge and jury, their decisions often swayed by personal interest or vendetta. Arthur, with Merlin's guidance, began to introduce reforms aimed at creating a more equitable system. He championed the idea that justice should be blind, applied equally to all, a radical concept in an age where social standing often dictated legal outcomes. This push for justice, while welcomed by the common folk, further alienated some of the more entrenched nobles who benefited from the old, chaotic system. They saw Arthur's reforms as an encroachment on their traditional rights and privileges. They murmured about a king who sought to diminish their power, to elevate commoners above their station. The early battles Arthur fought were not always against foreign invaders, but often against these rebellious lords, a testament to the internal struggles that plagued his nascent kingdom. These internal conflicts were not always direct military confrontations. Often, they involved intricate political maneuvering, attempts to undermine Arthur's authority through whispers and rumours, or by inciting local unrest. A king's power, especially in the early medieval period, was often a reflection of his ability to command the loyalty of his vassals and to project an image of strength and legitimacy. Any challenge to this image, however subtle, could be devastating. Merlin, ever the strategist, advised Arthur to choose his battles carefully. Not every slight warranted a full military response. Sometimes, a display of forgiveness, coupled with a firm warning, could be more effective in winning over a reluctant lord than brute force. This approach, however, required immense patience and a deep understanding of human nature, qualities that Arthur, though young, seemed to possess in abundance. It was during these formative years that Arthur began to forge his reputation, not just as a warrior, but as a wise and just ruler. He led his knights in campaigns against those who openly defied him, demonstrating his prowess on the battlefield. But he also showed mercy to those who surrendered, offering them a chance to swear fealty and contribute to the stability of the kingdom. This blend of strength and compassion was crucial in slowly winning over the hearts and minds of his people. The landscape of Britain during this time was a mosaic of petty kingdoms, tribal loyalties, and lingering Roman influences. The idea of a unified Britain under a single king was a distant dream, one that many powerful figures actively resisted. The drawing of the sword was merely the first step on a long and arduous journey. It was a symbol, a promise, but the reality of kingship demanded constant vigilance, shrewd political acumen, and an unwavering commitment to the arduous task of nation-building. Perhaps these early struggles, the constant need to prove himself, to overcome skepticism and outright rebellion, were what truly forged Arthur into the legendary king he would become. It was not the magic of the sword alone, but the trials and tribulations of his early reign that shaped his character, honed his leadership skills, and instilled in him the deep sense of responsibility that would define his rule. He learned that a king's power was not inherent, but a delicate balance of divine favour, martial strength, and the consent of the governed. And as the seasons turned, and the whispers of rebellion slowly began to fade, a new dawn for Britain, however fragile, began to break over the horizon. The coronation at Camlann was not merely a ceremony. It was a pronouncement, a promise whispered on the wind to a land weary of strife. Arthur, now king, felt the weight of the crown settle upon his brow, not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. His gaze, once filled with the fire of youth, now held a deeper, more reflective light, a wisdom that seemed to have been forged in the very heart of the turbulent times he had just navigated. Yet even with the sword of his father, Uther Pendragon, at his side, and the unwavering loyalty of his knights, Arthur knew that true kingship was not won on the battlefield alone. It was built upon a foundation of justice, counsel, and a vision for a better world. And in this grand endeavour he would not be alone. Merlin, the ancient sage, remained his closest advisor, a constant presence whose eyes seemed to hold the secrets of the ages. His counsel was a blend of practicality and prophecy, a guiding hand that steered Arthur through the treacherous currents of early reign. Merlin understood that the strength of a king lay not just in his might, but in the unity of his people. The petty squabbles of regional lords, the lingering resentments from generations of conflict, these were the true enemies that threatened to unravel the fragile peace Arthur had so painstakingly woven. It was Merlin who first spoke of a new order, a fellowship that would transcend the old hierarchies, where loyalty was pledged not to a man, but to an ideal. He envisioned a gathering where all voices could be heard, where counsel was given freely, and decisions were made for the common good. This vision, born in the quiet chambers of Camlann, would soon take physical form. The idea of the Round Table, as it came to be known, was a revolutionary concept in a world steeped in rigid social structures. In the great halls of kings and lords, the highest rankings sat at the head of the table, their authority visibly asserted. But Merlin, with his profound understanding of human nature and the subtle dynamics of power, saw the potential for discord in such arrangements. He proposed a table where no man was above another, where all sat as equals, a circle unbroken, symbolizing unity and endless purpose. The construction of this magnificent table was a feat of craftsmanship, a testament to the burgeoning peace. Skilled artisans, drawn from across the land, labored for months, shaping the finest oak, inlaying it with intricate designs that spoke of ancient lore and the promise of a new age. When it was finally unveiled in the Great Hall of Camelot, a name that would soon become synonymous with Arthur's reign, it was met with awe. It was not just a piece of furniture, it was a symbol, a silent declaration of Arthur's commitment to a different kind of leadership. Around this table, Arthur gathered his most trusted knights. These were men of courage and conviction, some seasoned warriors who had fought alongside him, others young and eager, drawn by the king's vision. Among them was Sir Lancelot, whose unparalleled skill in combat would become legendary, Sir Gawain, Arthur's nephew, known for his chivalry and unwavering loyalty, and Sir Kay, Arthur's foster brother, whose initial skepticism had given way to fierce devotion. Each knight, as they took their seat at the Round Table, pledged an oath, not just to Arthur, but to the ideals he embodied: justice, mercy, courage, and the protection of the innocent. This oath, sworn under the watchful eye of Merlin, bound them together in a brotherhood unlike any the world had ever seen. The early years of the Round Table were dedicated to establishing order and dispensing justice. Messengers constantly arrived at Camelot, bringing tales of injustice, of bandits preying on travellers, of corrupt lords abusing their power. Arthur, with his knights, would listen patiently, weighing the evidence, seeking the truth. Expeditions were dispatched, not for conquest, but for redress. The reputation of the Round Table grew with each act of justice, each wrong righted. Farmers could till their fields without fear. Merchants could travel their routes with greater security. And the common folk began to look to Camelot not as a distant seat of power, but as a beacon of hope. Merlin's influence extended beyond the political. He was a fount of knowledge, sharing ancient texts and wisdom that had been preserved through generations. He taught Arthur about the stars, about the healing properties of herbs, and about the delicate balance of nature. His presence imbued Camelot with an atmosphere of learning and enlightenment, a place where both might and intellect were valued. It was a time of renaissance, albeit a quiet one, where the seeds of a more civilized society were being carefully sown. Yet even in this golden dawn, shadows lingered. The land was vast, and pockets of resistance remained. Old feuds, like stubborn weeds, refused to be entirely uprooted. Some lords, clinging to the old ways, viewed Arthur's new order with suspicion, seeing it as an erosion of their own power. There were whispers of dark magic, of ancient forces that stirred in the wild, untamed corners of the island. Merlin, with his prescient gaze, was acutely aware of these lingering threats. He often spoke to Arthur of the delicate balance between light and shadow, reminding him that even the brightest flame casts a long shadow. One particular challenge came from the northern reaches, where the Picts, fierce and unyielding, continued to raid the borders. These were not mere bandits. They were a people with their own ancient traditions and a deep-seated distrust of the southern kingdoms. Arthur, guided by Merlin, understood that a lasting peace could not be achieved through brute force alone. He sought to understand their grievances, to find a way to coexist rather than simply conquer. This approach, unusual for its time, marked Arthur as a king who sought diplomacy before drawing his sword. Historians still debate the precise location of Camelot, and indeed whether it was a single, fixed city or a more symbolic centre of Arthur's power. Some scholars point to archaeological sites in Cornwall or Wales, suggesting possible fortifications that could have served as a royal seat. Others argue that Camelot was more of an ideal, a mythical representation of Arthur's reign, a concept rather than a concrete place. Regardless, the idea of Camelot, a place of justice and chivalry, took firm root in the collective imagination, inspiring countless tales and legends. The chroniclers of the time, such as Nennius in his Historia Brittonum, circa 9th century, mention Arthur's victories, but do not elaborate on a specific capital in the way later romances would. It is in later works, particularly those of Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, that Camelot truly emerges as the iconic seat of Arthur's court. Merlin, in his wisdom, often spoke of the importance of legends. He understood that stories had the power to shape a people, to inspire courage, and to instill hope. He encouraged the bards and poets who frequented Arthur's court, knowing that their verses would carry the tales of the Round Table far beyond the walls of Camelot. These tales, embellished and retold through generations, would become the very fabric of British identity. The daily life at Camelot, under Arthur's guidance, was a blend of martial training and intellectual pursuit. Knights honed their skills in the jousting fields and practice yards, their armour gleaming under the sun, their lances thudding against shields. But in the evenings, the great hall would often be filled with the sounds of music, of storytelling, and of lively debate. Scholars and philosophers were welcomed, their ideas discussed and pondered. Arthur himself was known to engage in these discussions, his mind as keen as his sword. He fostered an environment where strength was balanced with wisdom, and where the arts of peace were valued as highly as the arts of war. One lesser-known detail from this period is the emphasis on sustainable land management. Merlin, with his deep connection to the natural world, advised Arthur on practices that would ensure the fertility of the land and the well-being of its people. This included promoting crop rotation and forest conservation, an early form of ecological awareness that was far ahead of its time. While not explicitly documented in early chronicles, the spirit of stewardship, often attributed to Arthur's reign, suggests a broader concern for the welfare of his kingdom beyond military might. Perhaps these early efforts, guided by Merlin's ancient wisdom, laid the groundwork for a more prosperous and enduring realm. The Round Table, therefore, was more than just a symbol. It was a living, breathing institution. It was a place where conflicts were mediated, where justice was sought, and where the ideals of chivalry were forged. It was here that the seeds of a unified Britain were sown. A Britain where strength was tempered with mercy, and where the rule of law began to replace the rule of brute force. Arthur, with Merlin's constant guidance, was not just a king. He was a visionary, building a society that aspired to greatness, a society that would echo through the ages. The challenges were immense, and the path ahead was fraught with peril. The forces of chaos and darkness were never far away, always seeking to undermine the fragile peace. But with the Round Table as its heart, and Arthur's unwavering commitment as its soul, Camelot stood as a beacon, a testament to the enduring power of unity, justice, and the enduring dream of a better world. The wind whispered through the battlements of Camelot, carrying the hopes and dreams of a nascent nation, poised on the brink of a golden age. As the sun climbed higher over Camelot, casting long, golden shadows across its polished stones, the dream of Arthur began to take tangible form. His vision, once a whispered hope among loyal companions, now pulsed with the vibrant life of a flourishing court. The Round Table, more than just a piece of furniture, became the very heart of this new world, a symbol of equality, unity, and the shared pursuit of a higher ideal. It was here, in this hallowed hall, that the true spirit of chivalry was forged, attracting men of courage and conviction from across the land. The fame of Arthur's court spread like wildfire, carried on the winds of bardic songs and the hushed tales of travellers. Knights, drawn by the king's reputation for justice and his unwavering commitment to virtue, began to arrive at Camelot's gates. They came from distant shires, from ancient families, and from humble beginnings, all seeking to prove their worth and dedicate their swords to a cause greater than themselves. Among these, a constellation of legendary figures emerged, their names destined to echo through the ages. One of the first to arrive, and perhaps the most complex, was Sir Lancelot du Lac. He came from across the sea, a prince from a mysterious land, his reputation for peerless skill in arms preceding him. When he first presented himself at Camelot, his presence was like a sudden, bright star in the firmament, dazzling, powerful, and undeniably magnetic. Arthur, ever discerning, recognized in Lancelot not just a formidable warrior, but a man of profound, if sometimes troubled, honor. Their bond was immediate and deep, a brotherhood forged in mutual respect and shared ideals. Lancelot quickly became Arthur's most trusted champion, his right hand in battle and the very embodiment of knightly prowess. His strength was legendary. It was said that in a tournament, no knight could unseat him, and in battle, his sword moved with a speed and precision that bordered on the supernatural. Yet, beneath this formidable exterior lay a soul wrestling with its own passions, a complexity that would, in time, cast a long shadow over the gleaming perfection of Camelot. Then there was Sir Gawain, Arthur's nephew, a knight whose loyalty was as steadfast as the ancient oaks of Britain. Gawain was known for his courtesy, his unwavering courage, and a curious, almost mystical connection to the sun. His strength, it was believed, waxed and waned with the day, growing strongest at noon and fading as the sun set. He was a man of deep faith, often depicted as the most devout of the Round Table knights, and his sense of honor was absolute. Unlike Lancelot's sometimes brooding intensity, Gawain possessed a warmth and geniality that made him beloved by all. He was a knight of the people, humble despite his royal lineage, and always ready to champion the cause of the weak and the wronged. His adventures were numerous, often involving encounters with the supernatural, testing not only his martial skill but also his moral fortitude. And then Sir Percival, the innocent, the pure of heart. His story was one of remarkable transformation, a journey from a naive, almost wild youth raised in the solitude of the woods to a knight of profound spiritual insight. He was initially mocked for his rustic manners and lack of worldly knowledge, yet his innate goodness and unwavering sincerity shone through. Percival's quest was often depicted as one of spiritual enlightenment, a search for meaning beyond the clang of steel and the roar of battle. He embodied a different facet of chivalry, not just physical prowess, but moral purity and a quest for divine understanding. His early encounters with the world were often clumsy, yet his heart was always in the right place, guided by an instinctual sense of right and wrong. This blend of innocence and unwavering conviction made him uniquely suited for a particular sacred quest that would eventually define the Round Table's ultimate purpose. These knights, and many others whose names might be less celebrated but whose deeds were no less brave, formed the core of Arthur's vision. The Round Table was not merely a gathering of warriors. It was a brotherhood bound by an oath, a solemn vow to uphold justice, protect the innocent, and champion truth against falsehood. Their quests were not just random adventures, but purposeful journeys undertaken to right wrongs, to defeat monstrous beasts, to rescue maidens in distress, and to uncover ancient mysteries. Each knight, upon taking his seat, pledged himself to these ideals, understanding that his personal honor was intertwined with the collective honor of the table. The daily life at Camelot, when the knights were not away on their quests, was a vibrant tapestry of training, feasting, and counsel. The training fields echoed with the clash of swords and the thud of lances as knights honed their skills, ever preparing for the next challenge. The great hall, with its soaring ceilings and tapestries depicting heroic deeds, was often filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and lively debate. Arthur presided over all, a king who led by example, listening to the pleas of his subjects, arbitrating disputes, and always striving to embody the very virtues he asked of his knights. He was not a distant monarch, but a king among equals, albeit one whose wisdom and authority were universally acknowledged. One fascinating yet often overlooked detail about the Round Table era concerns the elaborate codes of conduct that governed knightly behaviour. While we often think of chivalry as a broad concept, it was in practice a highly detailed system of etiquette and ethics. Knights were expected to adhere to specific rules of engagement in battle, to show mercy to a defeated foe, and to protect women and children above all else. But beyond these grand gestures, there were also subtle, intricate protocols for everything from how to address a lady of noble birth, to the proper way to conduct oneself at a feast, or even the appropriate manner of offering a challenge. For instance, a knight was expected to offer 3 chances for an opponent to yield before striking a killing blow. A practice that speaks to a surprisingly formalized sense of battlefield honor. These codes, while perhaps not always perfectly observed, represented a conscious effort to civilize warfare and elevate the moral standing of the warrior class, distinguishing them from mere brigands. Historians still disagree, however, on the precise origins and extent of these chivalric codes. Some scholars argue that the Arthurian legends greatly romanticized and perhaps even invented many of these detailed protocols, projecting later medieval ideals back onto an earlier, more brutal period. They suggest that the age of chivalry, as depicted in the romances, was more an aspirational ideal than a widespread reality in 5th or 6th century Britain. Other historians contend that while the written codes may have been formalized later, the underlying principles of honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak were indeed nascent and developing within the warrior cultures of the post-Roman era. They point to early Celtic and Germanic heroic traditions that emphasized similar virtues, suggesting that Arthur's court might have been a crucible where these disparate influences began to coalesce into a more refined ethical system. The debate often centers on how much of the chivalric ideal was a reflection of historical practice and how much was a literary construct designed to inspire and instruct. The quests themselves were varied and often perilous. Sir Gawain, for instance, famously undertook the challenge of the Green Knight, a mysterious, axe-wielding figure who appeared at Camelot during a New Year's feast. The Green Knight proposed a grim game. One of Arthur's knights could strike off his head, but in return must agree to receive a similar blow exactly a year and a day later. Gawain, ever courageous, accepted the challenge, beheading the Green Knight, who then calmly picked up his own head and rode away, reminding Gawain of their appointment. This quest was not just a test of bravery, but of honesty, loyalty, and the ability to face one's own mortality with honor, as Gawain grappled with fear and temptation in the interim year. Lancelot's quests were often more focused on direct combat and the rescue of the unjustly imprisoned or threatened. His strength and skill were unparalleled, allowing him to overcome formidable foes and seemingly impossible odds. He rescued Queen Guinevere on multiple occasions from various kidnappers, including the treacherous Meleagant, and single-handedly defeated entire armies to uphold the honor of Camelot. His adventures were often characterized by a fierce, almost solitary determination, reflecting his powerful individualistic spirit. Yet even in his triumphs, there was often a hint of melancholy, a sense of a soul burdened by its own internal struggles. Percival's journey, in contrast, often involved more spiritual trials. His most famous quest, of course, was the search for the Holy Grail. Early in his career, before he fully understood the sacred nature of the quest, he encountered the wounded Fisher King and witnessed the Grail procession, but failed to ask the crucial questions that would have healed the king and the desolate land. This initial failure, a result of his youthful inexperience and adherence to an overly strict code of silence, became a profound lesson. He spent years wandering, seeking atonement and spiritual growth, eventually becoming one of the few, if not the only, knight pure enough to truly behold the Grail. His journey underscored the idea that true chivalry was not just about wielding a sword, but about cultivating a pure heart and an unshakable faith. These individual quests, while seemingly disparate, all contributed to the overarching narrative of Arthur's reign. They were the threads that wove the tapestry of Camelot's glory, each victory affirming the ideals of the Round Table, each challenge overcome, strengthening the resolve of the knights. The stories of these quests, embellished and retold over centuries, became the very definition of heroism and virtue in the medieval imagination. They provided moral lessons, inspiring listeners to strive for goodness, to defend the weak, and to pursue noble goals, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Round Table, therefore, was not merely a collection of valiant individuals, but a living, breathing entity, a collective conscience for a kingdom striving for enlightenment. It was a place where ideals were tested, where courage was celebrated, and where the boundaries of human endurance and moral integrity were constantly pushed. The very air within Camelot's walls seemed to hum with purpose, a vibrant energy fueled by the shared commitment to Arthur's dream. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars, recounting tales of honor and sacrifice, of battles fought for justice, and of the unwavering belief in a better world. The flourishing of the Round Table, however, also brought its own set of challenges. The very fame and power it accumulated began to attract envy and resentment from those who clung to older, more brutal ways. The strict moral code, while inspiring, also created immense pressure on the knights to live up to impossibly high standards. The personal failings of even the greatest among them would inevitably cast long shadows, threatening to undermine the very foundation of trust and unity that Arthur had so painstakingly built. The seeds of future discord, though unseen at this peak of Camelot's glory, were already being sown, subtly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the surface of its dazzling splendor. For even in the brightest of ages, the human heart, with its complex desires and vulnerabilities, remains ever present, remained the most unpredictable and powerful force of all. The air within Camelot, once so pure and clear, began to thicken with an unspoken tension, the subtle shift in the currents of loyalty and affection. It was a change as imperceptible as the slow turning of seasons, yet as profound as the deepest winter chill. The Round Table, that symbol of perfect equality and unwavering purpose, still gleamed under the torchlight, but its polished surface now reflected not just the noble faces of knights, but also the shadows of unspoken desires and hidden glances. At the heart of this burgeoning disquiet lay a love that was both incandescent and forbidden, the deep, consuming affection between Queen Guinevere and Sir Lancelot. He, the bravest and most celebrated of Arthur's knights, a man whose very name was synonymous with chivalry and strength, found himself ensnared by a passion that defied his vows and threatened the very foundation of his king's realm. She, the radiant queen, whose beauty had captivated Arthur and whose presence graced every courtly gathering, found her heart drawn irrevocably to a man who was not her husband. Their love was not born of sudden impulse, but rather blossomed slowly, like a rare and delicate flower in the shadowed corners of a sunlit garden. It began with admiring glances across crowded halls, with shared laughter that lingered a moment too long, with conversations that drifted into deeper, more personal realms than was proper. Lancelot, ever the perfect knight, had initially seen Guinevere as an untouchable ideal, the embodiment of courtly grace. He had championed her honor, defended her name, and served her with an unblemished devotion that was at first entirely within the bounds of chivalry. But proximity, shared experiences, and the undeniable pull of kindred spirits began to weave a different kind of tapestry between them. Guinevere, in turn, found in Lancelot a depth of understanding and a fervent adoration that perhaps even Arthur, burdened by the weight of kingship, could not always provide. Arthur's love for his queen was steadfast and profound, but it was also a love intertwined with the responsibilities of a monarch, a love that had to share space with the demands of his kingdom. Lancelot's love, however, was singular, intense, and focused entirely on her. It was a dangerous solace, a thrilling comfort. Their clandestine meetings, at first accidental, then carefully orchestrated, became the secret pulse of Camelot. A hushed word in a secluded corridor, a fleeting touch of hands beneath a shared cloak during a moonlit stroll through the castle gardens, a stolen moment in a quiet chamber while the court slept. These were the threads that wove their forbidden tapestry. The air around them crackled with an electricity that only they could feel. A silent language spoken through the eyes, understood by the heart. It was a love that thrived in the shadows, fueled by the very danger of its existence. Yet such a powerful secret could not remain entirely hidden. Whispers like tendrils of mist began to curl through the castle. A servant might notice a door ajar. A knight might catch a glimpse of a lingering embrace. A lady-in-waiting might observe the way the Queen's eyes followed Lancelot across the hall. These were not direct accusations, but rather subtle shifts in the atmosphere, a growing unease that settled over the court. The very perfection of Camelot, its idealized vision of honor and loyalty, made any deviation from that ideal all the more glaring, all the more scandalous. The code of chivalry, which Lancelot so perfectly embodied in every other aspect of his life, stood in stark contrast to his betrayal of Arthur. He was torn, caught between his unwavering loyalty to his king and his uncontrollable passion for his queen. This internal conflict, though unseen by most, began to gnaw at his soul, dimming the bright light of his heroism. His prowess in battle remained undiminished, his courage unwavering, but a shadow had fallen across his spirit, a secret burden that he carried with him even into the most glorious of tournaments. Historians and literary scholars have long debated the precise nature and timeline of the affair. Some narratives suggest it began relatively early in Arthur's reign, a slow burn that intensified over years, while others place its most passionate phase later, as the court grew more established and perhaps more complacent. One early Welsh triad, though not directly detailing the affair, mentions Guinevere's treachery as one of the 3 harmful blows of the island of Britain, hinting at a deep-seated betrayal long before the more elaborate romances emerged. This suggests that the core idea of Guinevere's infidelity, or at least a perceived disloyalty, might have ancient roots, evolving over centuries into the iconic Lancelot-Guinevere narrative we know today. The consequences of this secret love were insidious, slowly eroding the moral fabric of Camelot from within. The unity that Arthur had so painstakingly forged, the bond of trust that held the Round Table together, began to fray. When the most celebrated knight and the Queen herself were engaged in such a profound deception, it set a dangerous precedent, subtly undermining the very ideals that Camelot stood for. It created an environment where suspicion could take root, where loyalty could be questioned, and where the perfect image of the court began to crack. This erosion was not immediately obvious. For a time, the glory of Camelot continued to shine brightly. Knights rode forth on quests, justice was dispensed, and the kingdom prospered. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discord were being sown. The affair provided fertile ground for those who harbored resentment or jealousy, those who sought to undermine Arthur's authority. It gave ammunition to those who wished to see the Round Table falter. A lesser-known detail from some medieval texts suggests that Arthur himself, in his profound wisdom and perhaps his deep love for both Guinevere and Lancelot, might have been aware of the affair long before it was publicly exposed. Some tales hint at his deliberate blindness, a king choosing to ignore a painful truth for the sake of preserving the fragile peace and unity of his kingdom, perhaps hoping it would simply fade away. This portrayal adds another layer of tragic complexity to Arthur's character, transforming him from a cuckolded husband into a king making an agonizing choice for the greater good, even if it meant personal heartbreak. This deliberate ignorance, if true, would have been a heavy burden, a silent sacrifice that further illustrates the precarious balance upon which Camelot rested. The slow creep of suspicion and jealousy began to infect the very heart of the Round Table. Sir Agravain, a knight known for his rigid adherence to the letter of the law, and perhaps a touch of malice, along with his brother Mordred, who harboured his own dark ambitions, became the primary instigators of the affair's exposure. They watched, they gathered evidence, and they waited for the opportune moment to strike, not out of a pure desire for justice, but often driven by personal animosity towards Lancelot or a desire to destabilize Arthur's reign. Their motives were complex. Agravain, a nephew of Arthur, was deeply conservative and viewed the affair as a profound moral failing that dishonoured the king and the Round Table. Mordred, on the other hand, was a character shrouded in ambiguity, often portrayed as Arthur's illegitimate son or nephew, whose ambition knew no bounds. For Mordred, the affair was a strategic weakness, a lever to pry open the cracks in Arthur's power and perhaps seize the throne for himself. The moment of revelation, when it finally came, was orchestrated with cruel precision. While Lancelot and Guinevere were together in the Queen's chambers, Agravain, Mordred, and a band of knights burst in, intending to catch them in the act and expose their treachery to the entire court. This confrontation, a pivotal moment in the Arthurian saga, marked the beginning of the end for the idealized Camelot. Lancelot, caught unawares but still possessing his legendary strength and skill, fought his way out of the Queen's chambers, slaying several of the attacking knights in the process. His escape, though a testament to his prowess, also served as undeniable proof of his guilt. Guinevere, left behind, faced the wrath of the court and the agonizing judgment of her husband. The exposure of the affair plunged Camelot into a crisis of unprecedented scale. Arthur, faced with undeniable proof of his wife's infidelity and his most trusted knight's betrayal, was caught in an impossible dilemma. According to the laws of the land and the strictures of chivalry, Guinevere was guilty of treason and adultery, crimes punishable by death at the stake. Lancelot, by slaying Arthur's knights, had compounded his own transgressions, defying the king's authority. Arthur's heart was undoubtedly broken. The man he had loved as a brother, the woman he had cherished as his queen, had both betrayed him in the most profound way. Yet his duty as king demanded that he uphold the law, even if it meant condemning those he loved most. This was the ultimate test of his reign, a choice between personal affection and the rule of law that he had worked so hard to establish. The decision to condemn Guinevere to the stake was made with immense sorrow, a heavy burden placed upon a king who had always sought justice and mercy. But the laws of the land were clear, and to flout them would be to undermine his own authority and the very legal framework of Camelot. This act, though legally sound, ignited a chain of events that would tear the kingdom apart. Lancelot, upon learning of Guinevere's impending execution, could not stand idly by. His love for her, though forbidden, was absolute. He gathered his loyal kinsmen and rode to her rescue, a desperate act of defiance against his king. In the ensuing battle, Lancelot once again displayed his formidable skill, but in the chaos, he inadvertently slew two of Arthur's most loyal and beloved knights, Sir Gareth and Sir Gaheris, brothers of Sir Gawain. This was a tragedy of immense proportions, a deeply personal blow that would irrevocably shatter the bonds of the Round Table. The deaths of Gareth and Gaheris, particularly Gareth, who had been a close friend and admirer of Lancelot, ignited a fierce and unquenchable thirst for vengeance in Sir Gawain. Gawain, once Lancelot's dearest companion, became his most bitter enemy. His grief and rage were so profound that he demanded Arthur pursue Lancelot relentlessly, even if it meant tearing the kingdom apart. This demand placed Arthur in an even more agonizing position. He had lost his queen's fidelity, his best friend's loyalty, and now the unity of his court. He was forced to choose between upholding the law and pursuing Lancelot, thereby alienating a significant portion of his knights, or letting Lancelot go, which would be seen as a sign of weakness and an abandonment of justice. The subsequent war between Arthur and Lancelot was a slow, painful bleeding of Camelot's strength. Arthur, swayed by Gawain's relentless pressure and his own sense of justice, pursued Lancelot to France, besieging his castles and engaging in a protracted conflict. The flower of Camelot's knighthood was divided, fighting amongst themselves instead of uniting against external threats or working for the good of the kingdom. The once unbreakable fellowship of the Round Table was shattered, its members now arrayed against each other in a tragic civil war. While Arthur was away campaigning in France, pursuing Lancelot, the final, fatal blow to Camelot was struck. Mordred, seizing the opportunity presented by Arthur's absence and the internal strife, usurped the throne. He spread false rumors of Arthur's death, rallied support from disaffected lords, and attempted to marry Guinevere, consolidating his power. This act of blatant treason, fueled by ambition and the chaos sown by the Lancelot-Guinevere affair, forced Arthur to abandon his pursuit of Lancelot and return to Britain to reclaim his kingdom. The return of Arthur to confront Mordred led to the climactic and devastating Battle of Camlann. It was a battle of brothers, of former allies, a tragic culmination of all the discord and betrayal that had festered within Camelot. The field of Camlann became the grave of Arthur's dream, a place where the glory of the Round Table met its bloody end. The passionate, illicit love between Lancelot and Guinevere, though born of deep affection, ultimately proved to be the fatal flaw in the tapestry of Camelot. It was not a single dramatic act, but a slow, insidious process of erosion, a weakening of the moral and ethical foundations upon which Arthur had built his kingdom. The betrayal, the subsequent divisions, the internecine conflict, all stemmed, directly or indirectly, from that forbidden love. The mystery that continues to puzzle scholars is not if the affair happened in the legends, but why it became such a central and destructive force. Was it merely a literary device to introduce conflict and tragedy? Or did it reflect deeper societal anxieties about loyalty, marriage, and power in medieval courts? Some argue it served as a cautionary tale against the dangers of courtly love when it transgressed marital vows, while others see it as a reflection of the inherent fragility of even the most idealized human institutions. Perhaps these stories, passed down through generations, whisper to us of the eternal human struggle between duty and desire, between the ideals we strive for and the passions that can undo us. The fall of Camelot, therefore, was not merely the result of a single battle or a single villain. It was the tragic consequence of a love that, though powerful and real, could not exist within the framework of the perfect kingdom. It was the unraveling of a dream, the slow descent from an age of gold into an age of sorrow, initiated by the very hearts that had once helped to build its glory. The echoes of their love and its devastating aftermath continue to resonate through the ages, a poignant reminder of the delicate balance between human passion and the fragile construct of power and order. The air, once thick with the joyous clang of armor and the boisterous laughter of knights, began to subtly shift, growing heavier with an unspoken longing. The Round Table, for all its glory and the valiant deeds wrought in its name, now found itself facing a different kind of challenge. One not of earthly foes or political intrigue, but of the spirit. It was in this atmosphere of quiet yearning that the whispers of the Holy Grail began to take root. A legend that promised not just salvation, but a profound spiritual awakening. The Grail, as the tales described it, was no mere chalice. It was said to be the cup from which Christ drank at the Last Supper, or perhaps the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion, brought to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea. Its power was immeasurable, its presence a guarantee of eternal life, spiritual purity, and a connection to the divine. To behold it, to touch it, was to transcend the earthly realm. Such a prize, however, was not for the impure of heart, nor for those whose hands were stained by sin or earthly ambition. It demanded a purity of spirit, a true devotion that few could claim. One fateful Pentecost, as the knights gathered at Camelot, a sudden blinding light filled the great hall. A vision, shimmering and ethereal, appeared before them, a veiled image of the Holy Grail, surrounded by a celestial radiance. No one could grasp it. No one could touch it, yet its presence was undeniable, leaving an indelible mark on the souls of all who witnessed it. This was the catalyst. From that moment, a profound disquiet settled upon the knights. The earthly triumphs, the jousts, the battles, the courtly loves, all seemed to pale in comparison to the spiritual glory that the Grail promised. King Arthur, ever the pragmatic ruler, felt a tremor of apprehension. He saw the fire in their eyes, the fervent devotion that had replaced their usual martial zeal. He knew, with a heavy heart, that this quest, unlike any other, would scatter his knights, perhaps irrevocably. He expressed his sorrow, his fear that many would embark on a journey from which they would never return, or return changed beyond recognition. Yet he could not forbid them. The call of the Grail was too strong, too deeply etched into their very beings. It was a divine summons, and to deny it would be to deny their own souls. And so one by one, and in small groups, the Knights of the Round Table departed from Camelot, each vowing to seek the Holy Grail. The quest was unique, for it had no clear path, no map, no earthly foe to conquer. It was a journey inward as much as outward, a test of faith, humility, and spiritual fortitude. Their armor, once gleaming with the symbols of earthly chivalry, now seemed to carry a different weight, a quiet expectation of divine encounter. Among the first to set forth was Sir Lancelot, the greatest knight of them all, renowned for his strength, his courage, and his unparalleled skill in battle. Yet Lancelot carried a secret burden, a love for Queen Guinevere that, despite his noble intentions, was a profound stain on his soul. He yearned for the Grail, perhaps more than any other, believing it held the key to his redemption. A cleansing of the sin that gnawed at his conscience. His journey was fraught with inner turmoil, his physical prowess often failing him in the face of spiritual challenges. He encountered hermits who spoke of humility and penance, visions that reproached his worldly attachments, and tests that demanded a purity he could not yet fully achieve. Though he performed many acts of kindness and valor, helping those in need, his ultimate goal, the full vision of the Grail, remained just beyond his grasp, veiled by the very sin he sought to expiate. Then there was Sir Percival, a knight of a different mould. He had grown up in the wilderness, innocent of courtly ways, and possessed a natural purity of heart. His journey was one of discovery, of learning the true meaning of chivalry. And faith. He faced trials that tested his compassion and his resilience, encountering strange visions and mysterious figures who guided him, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, toward a deeper understanding of spiritual truth. His innocence, however, was not without its own challenges. He often stumbled due to his naivety, making mistakes that taught him valuable lessons about discernment and wisdom. Yet, his unwavering faith and his inherent goodness allowed him to persevere, drawing him ever closer to the sacred object. But it was Galahad, the purest of all knights, who was destined to achieve the quest. He was Lancelot's son, yet his character was a stark contrast to his father's burdened soul. Galahad was born of a miraculous union. His mother, Elaine of Corbinic, a woman of great beauty and virtue, who had been deceived into believing Lancelot was Guinevere. He had been raised in a monastery, his life steeped in piety and spiritual devotion. He was the knight foretold to sit in the Siege Perilous, the vacant seat at the Round Table that only the purest could occupy without perishing. When he arrived at Camelot, young and untainted, the seat of danger glowed, and Galahad sat there unharmed, a clear sign of his divine favour. Galahad's quest for the Grail was marked by divine intervention and miraculous encounters. He moved through the world with an aura of grace, his deeds always righteous, his heart unburdened by worldly desires or personal ambition. He healed the sick, cast out demons, and righted wrongs, not for glory, but out of pure, selfless love. He carried a shield given to him by Joseph of Arimathea, a white shield with a red cross, symbolizing his purity and his divine mission. His path was illuminated by signs and wonders, guiding him through desolate lands and treacherous trials, always leading him closer to the ultimate revelation. The journey of the Grail was a solitary one for many, a profound, internal pilgrimage that stripped away the superficial layers of knighthood, revealing the true essence of each man. Some knights, like Sir Gawain, known for his earthly courage and loyalty, found themselves struggling. Gawain, though brave and honourable, was too bound by worldly concerns, by the pursuit of earthly glory and the pleasures of the flesh. He encountered a hermit who chastised him for his lack of true faith, his reliance on earthly power rather than divine grace. He performed acts of valour, but his heart remained somewhat hardened, unable to fully embrace the spiritual humility required for the Grail. He returned to Camelot disheartened, having seen only glimpses of the Grail, but never its full glory. Other knights, less celebrated, simply vanished, lost to the wilderness or to their own spiritual failings. The quest was a crucible, burning away the dross and leaving only the purest gold. It was a journey that demanded sacrifice, not of life, but of ego, of pride, of worldly attachments. Historians still debate the precise origins of the Grail legend, with some tracing its roots to ancient Celtic myths of magical cauldrons and life-giving vessels. while others argue for a more direct Christian lineage, linking it to apocryphal gospels and early Christian traditions. The very ambiguity of its origins only added to its mystical allure, allowing it to resonate deeply with the spiritual anxieties of the medieval period. The Grail, in essence, became a symbol of humanity's eternal yearning for meaning, for transcendence, for a connection to something greater than themselves. As the quest progressed, the Round Table, once a symbol of unity and strength, began to show visible cracks. The absence of so many knights left Camelot feeling hollow, its halls echoing with a new silence. The focus of the court shifted from earthly governance and chivalric tournaments to spiritual contemplation and the fate of the Grail seekers. Arthur felt the weight of this transformation, understanding that the very fabric of his kingdom was being reshaped by this divine intervention. The earthly bonds that held his knights together were loosening, replaced by individual spiritual quests that by their very nature were solitary. The ultimate culmination of the Grail quest saw Galahad, Percival, and Bors, another pure knight, reach the castle of Corbinic, the Fisher King's domain, where the Grail was kept. There they witnessed the full glory of the Holy Grail, unveiled before them in a transcendent vision. They saw a procession of angels, and the Grail itself, radiating an unimaginable light. It was a moment of profound spiritual communion, a direct connection to the divine. Galahad, having achieved his destiny, was granted the ultimate boon, to choose his own death. He chose to ascend to heaven, his soul carried away by angels, leaving the earthly realm forever. Percival, deeply moved by the experience, became a hermit, dedicating his life to prayer and contemplation. Bors returned to Camelot, bearing the tale of their miraculous journey, a testament to the divine power they had witnessed. The return of Bors and the scattered, often broken accounts of other knights brought a profound quietude to Camelot. The Grail had been found, but it had also been taken away, its earthly presence fleeting. The quest had not brought unity, but rather had highlighted the inherent divisions within the Round Table. Lancelot, though he had seen glimpses of the Grail, had been denied its full vision, a stark reminder of his unconfessed sin. His heart was heavy with regret, his spirit bruised by the knowledge of his own failings. The Grail quest, while a spiritual triumph for a select few, was a tragedy for the Round Table as a whole. It had exposed the moral failings of many, and the inherent conflict between earthly chivalry and divine purity. The knights who had set out with such fervour returned, if they returned at all, as changed men. Some were purified, others were humbled, and still others were broken by the weight of their own imperfections. The unity that Arthur had so carefully forged was now fractured, not by external enemies, but by the very spiritual aspirations of his most trusted men. The quest for the Holy Grail marked a turning point in the Arthurian saga. It signalled the beginning of the end for the golden age of Camelot. The idealism that had once fueled the Round Table was now tempered by a profound sense of spiritual longing and the stark reality of human imperfection. The earthly glory that had once seemed so paramount now felt hollow, overshadowed by the transcendent power of the divine. The seeds of discord, sown long before by Lancelot's secret love and the inherent flaws in human nature, began to sprout with renewed vigour in the wake of the Grail's departure. The Round Table, though still physically intact, was spiritually broken. Its knights now walking different paths, their hearts filled with disparate experiences and often profound sorrow. The quest for the Grail had shown them the face of God, but in doing so, it had also revealed the deep, unbridgeable chasm between the earthly and the divine, a chasm that would ultimately swallow the very foundations of Arthur's legendary kingdom. The air in Camelot, once vibrant with the clinking of armor and the joyous laughter of feasts, began to thicken with an unseen dread. A chill wind, not of winter, but of discontent, whispered through the castle's tapestries, stirring them like restless spirits. The seeds of destruction, sown long ago in moments of passion and pride, were now beginning to sprout, their roots intertwining around the very foundations of Arthur's reign. Mordred, the king's illegitimate son, born of the ill-fated union with Morgause, had grown to manhood in the shadow of a father who did not acknowledge him, and a mother who harboured a bitter hatred for Arthur. This dark lineage, combined with a cunning intellect and a heart devoid of true loyalty, made him a dangerous figure. While Arthur was often away, tending to the needs of his sprawling kingdom, or leading his knights in distant campaigns, Mordred had been left to manage affairs in Camelot, a position that granted him access to the levers of power and the ear of those who felt overlooked or wronged. He observed the subtle cracks in the round table, the jealousies that simmered beneath the surface of camaraderie, the whispers of Lancelot and Guinevere's forbidden love that, despite Arthur's efforts to ignore, were becoming increasingly difficult to silence. Mordred, with a serpent's guile, began to exploit these vulnerabilities. He cultivated alliances with disgruntled nobles, those who chafed under Arthur's strict codes of chivalry or coveted greater lands and influence. He fanned the flames of suspicion, turning knight against knight, lord against king. The scandal of Lancelot and Guinevere, once a hushed secret, became Mordred's most potent weapon. He orchestrated their exposure, catching them in a compromising moment. Betrayal that shattered Arthur's trust and tore at the very fabric of his kingdom. The ensuing trial of Guinevere, condemned to burn at the stake for treason and adultery, was a public spectacle that horrified many. Yet for Mordred, it was a necessary step in his ascent. Lancelot's daring rescue of the Queen, a desperate act of love and loyalty, resulted in the deaths of several loyal knights, including Gareth and Gaheris, nephews of Arthur. This tragic event ignited a blood feud between Lancelot and Arthur, forcing the once inseparable friends into open warfare. Arthur, torn between his love for Guinevere, his friendship with Lancelot, and his duty to uphold the law, found himself in an impossible position. He was compelled to pursue Lancelot to France, leaving Mordred in charge of Camelot once more. This was the moment Mordred had been waiting for. With Arthur and many of his most loyal knights across the Channel fighting a war born of heartbreak, Mordred seized his opportunity. He declared Arthur dead and usurped the throne, proclaiming himself King of Britain. He even attempted to force Guinevere into marriage, a move designed to legitimize his claim and further humiliate Arthur. However, Guinevere, despite her past transgressions, remained steadfastly loyal to Arthur, taking refuge in a convent and refusing Mordred's advances. News of Mordred's treachery reached Arthur in France, a devastating blow that eclipsed even the pain of Lancelot's betrayal. The king, his heart heavy with sorrow and anger, was forced to abandon his campaign against Lancelot and return to Britain to reclaim his kingdom. Lancelot, hearing of Mordred's usurpation, offered his aid to Arthur, but the king, still reeling from the wounds of their past, refused. A decision many historians still debate as to its wisdom. Could Lancelot's formidable strength and loyalty have turned the tide? Or was the rift between them too deep to ever truly mend? The return of Arthur to Britain was met with a kingdom divided. Some nobles, swayed by Mordred's promises or intimidated by his growing power, had pledged their allegiance to the usurper. Others, still loyal to Arthur, rallied to his banner. The stage was open, set for a civil war, a conflict that would pit Britons against Britons, and ultimately father against son. The decisive confrontation took place on the plains of Camlann, a desolate and windswept landscape that would forever be etched into the annals of legend. The night before the battle, Arthur was plagued by prophetic dreams, visions of a dragon and a serpent locked in a deadly struggle, and of himself falling into a dark abyss. These omens, combined with the grim determination in the eyes of his remaining knights, weighed heavily on his soul. On the fateful day, a treaty was proposed, a last desperate attempt to avert bloodshed. Both sides agreed to a parley, with strict instructions that no weapon should be drawn. But fate, or perhaps the malevolent hand of Mordred, intervened. A knight, stung by an adder that had slithered from the tall grass, instinctively drew his sword to kill the snake. The glint of steel in the sunlight was misinterpreted by the opposing army as an act of aggression, and with a terrible cry, the battle was joined. The Battle of Camlann was a brutal and bloody affair, a chaotic maelstrom of steel and screams. The flower of Arthur's knighthood, already diminished by years of war and internal strife, fought with a desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and weary. The ground became soaked with blood, and the air filled with the cries of the dying. Arthur, a king in his prime, fought with the fury of a wounded lion, seeking out Mordred amidst the carnage. Finally, their eyes met across the battlefield, father and son, locked in a dance of destiny. Arthur, wielding his mighty sword Excalibur, charged at Mordred. Mordred, equally determined, met his father's attack. The clash of their blades echoed across the field, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. With a desperate thrust, Arthur impaled Mordred, but in his dying throes, Mordred struck a mortal blow to Arthur's head. Both fell, one dead, the other grievously wounded. The remaining knights of the Round Table, witnessing the fall of their king, were shattered. The battle, already a rout, became a desperate flight. Only a handful of Arthur's loyalists remained, among them Sir Bedivere, who found his king lying on the blood-soaked earth, barely clinging to life. Arthur, his voice weak and fading, commanded Bedivere to take Excalibur and cast it into the lake. Bedivere, reluctant to part with such a legendary blade, twice hid the sword and returned to Arthur, claiming he had fulfilled the king's wish. But Arthur, with the wisdom of a dying man, knew he was lying, asking him what he had seen. When Bedivere finally cast Excalibur into the shimmering waters, a hand, clad in white samite, rose from the depths to catch it, brandish it thrice, and then pull it beneath the surface. This lesser-known detail, the triple brandishing of the sword, often gets overlooked in the grand narrative, yet it adds a mystical flourish to the sword's return to its rightful owner. With his final wish granted, Arthur was carried to a barge by 3 mysterious queens, veiled and sorrowful. They bore him away to the mythical island of Avalon, a place of healing and eternal rest. Whether Arthur truly died or merely sleeps, awaiting the day he will return to save Britain in its hour of greatest need, remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the Arthurian legend. The absence of a definitive burial site for Arthur, despite the claims of Glastonbury Abbey in the 12th century, only fuels this speculation. Perhaps these misty shores of Avalon still whisper stories to the stars, awaiting the king's awakening. The Sundering of Camelot was complete. The once glorious kingdom, built on ideals of chivalry and justice, had crumbled from within, a victim of ambition, betrayal, and the tragic flaws of its heroes. The Round Table, once a symbol of unity and equality, was now a shattered relic, its knights scattered, their dreams of a perfect world dissolve, dead into dust. The golden age of Arthur was over, leaving behind a legacy of both triumph and tragedy, a testament to the enduring power of human aspiration and the inevitable shadow of human failing. The echoes of their deeds, however, would resonate through the centuries, shaping the very soul of Britain and inspiring countless tales of courage, love, and loss. The air itself seemed to thicken with a premonition of sorrow as the armies gathered on the plains of Camlann. A leaden sky pressed down upon the land, mirroring the heavy hearts of those arrayed for battle. Arthur, his face etched with a profound weariness that even the crown could not conceal, surveyed his assembled knights. They were fewer now, the flower of his chivalry diminished by years of conflict and the insidious whispers of treachery. Yet their loyalty, though tested, remained steadfast. Across the desolate expanse, Mordred's forces bristled, a dark tide of ambition and resentment. The banners, once united under the Dragon of Wessex, now stood in stark opposition, a cruel testament to a kingdom torn asunder. The days leading up to Camlann had been fraught with a desperate hope for peace. Arthur, ever the king who sought reconciliation, had attempted to parley with Mordred. Legends speak of a final, tense meeting between them, perhaps on a small hillock overlooking the fated field, where the wind carried the scent of approaching storm. Terms were discussed, compromises offered, but the chasm between them was too wide, too deep. Mordred, emboldened by his perceived strength, and perhaps by a twisted sense of destiny, refused to yield. He saw not a father figure, nor a king, but a rival, an obstacle to his own ascendancy. Some tales suggest that a serpent, a harbinger of ill omen, slithered from the grass during these negotiations, startling a knight who drew his sword, thus igniting the spark that set the whole field ablaze. Whether this was a literal event or a symbolic embellishment, the outcome was the same. The fragile truce shattered, and the clang of steel became inevitable. The morning of the battle dawned with a chilling mist, clinging to the ground like a shroud. The silence before the storm was absolute, broken only by the nervous shifting of men and the occasional whinny of a warhorse. Arthur, clad in his gleaming armour, rode along his lines, his voice, though perhaps strained, carrying the weight of his authority and the love he held for his men. He spoke not of glory, but of duty, of defending the ideals they had sworn to uphold. His words were a balm and a steeling force, reminding them of the Round Table's promise, even as that promise seemed to crumble around them. The clash, when it came, was cataclysmic. The ground trembled beneath the charge of cavalry, the air filled with the roar of men and the shriek of steel on steel. It was not a battle of tactics and grand manoeuvres so much as a brutal, desperate melee, a fratricidal conflict that consumed all in its path. Brother fought brother, former comrades now locked in a death embrace. The ideals of chivalry, once the guiding star of Arthur's reign, were drowned in a sea of blood and despair. The accounts of Camlann, though often veiled in poetic tragedy, consistently describe a scene of utter devastation, a battle where victory itself was a hollow prize. Among the swirling chaos, Arthur fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, his legendary sword, Excalibur, a blur of silver in the gloom. He sought out Mordred, driven by a terrible resolve. This was not merely a battle for a throne, it was a confrontation with the very betrayal that had gnawed at the heart of his kingdom. He saw the faces of fallen knights, the shattered dreams of Camelot, reflected in Mordred's defiant eyes. The final fatal encounter between Arthur and Mordred is shrouded in the mists of legend, yet its tragic intensity resonates through time. Some versions depict a direct, brutal duel, a clash of two titans where fate had already cast its die. Others suggest a more chaotic sequence, with Arthur cutting a path through Mordred's ranks, his fury a terrible force, until he found his treacherous kinsman. Regardless of the exact circumstances, their meeting was the climax of a long, painful unraveling. Arthur, with a strength born of desperation and sorrow, struck Mordred a blow. But even in his dying moments, Mordred retaliated, perhaps with a final, desperate thrust of his own sword, or a sudden, unexpected lunge. The wound Arthur received was grievous, a blow that would ultimately seal his fate. The image of the two, locked in their death struggle, one falling, the other mortally wounded, is one of the most enduring and poignant in the Arthurian cycle. It is the moment when the light of Camelot truly began to fade. The battle raged on. But with the fall of both Arthur and Mordred, the spirit of the fighting began to wane. The field became a charnel house, littered with the bodies of brave men, their armour glinting dully in the fading light. Only a handful of Arthur's knights remained, their hearts heavy with grief and the crushing weight of defeat. Sir Lucan and Sir Bedivere, among the last loyal companions, found their king, bleeding and gravely injured, on the desolate battlefield. Historians and literary scholars have long debated the precise location of Camlann, while various sites in Britain have been proposed, from Camber Glanna on Hadrian's Wall to locations in Cornwall or Wales. No definitive archaeological evidence has ever emerged to pinpoint the exact spot. This enduring mystery only adds to the mythical quality of the battle, allowing it to exist in a liminal space between history and legend. Perhaps the very ambiguity of its location serves to emphasize that Camlann was not merely a physical place, but a symbolic one, representing the end of an era, the collapse of an ideal. With his last breaths, Arthur gave his final, poignant instructions. He commanded Sir Bedivere to return Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake. This act, more than any other, signifies the passing of an age. Excalibur, a gift from the magical realm, was now to be returned to its source, severing the last tangible link between Arthur's reign and the mystical world that had so often intertwined with it. Bedivere, his heart aching, initially hesitated, unable to part with such a symbol of his king's greatness. He hid the sword twice, before finally, at Arthur's insistence, casting it into the shimmering waters. The sight of a hand rising from the lake to catch the sword, then vanishing beneath the surface, is a powerful image of farewell, a final, mystical flourish to a life steeped in wonder. The scholarly dispute regarding the historicity of Arthur often hinges on events like Camlann. Was there a historical battle that inspired this legendary conflict? Some scholars point to a possible 5th or 6th century battle, perhaps against Saxon invaders, where a great British leader fell. Others argue that Camlann is entirely a literary construct, a narrative device to bring a tragic end to a heroic saga. The 9th century Annales Cambriae, Welsh annals, briefly mention a battle of Camlann in which Arthur and Medrawd perished, dated to AD 537. This brief, tantalizing entry is one of the earliest historical references to Arthur and Camlann, yet it provides no details, leaving ample room for interpretation and debate. The very brevity of the entry, however, has fueled centuries of speculation, making Camlann a cornerstone of the historical Arthurian debate. After Excalibur was returned, Arthur was carried by his last loyal knights to a waiting barge. The air grew heavy with an otherworldly stillness. On the barge, veiled women, often identified as queens or enchantresses, awaited him. Among them, some legends say, was Morgan Le Fay, his half-sister, now perhaps reconciled in sorrow, or even the Lady of the Lake herself. This journey across the water to the mythical island of Avalon is perhaps the most enduring and hopeful aspect of Arthur's end. Avalon, a place of healing and eternal rest, became the destination for the wounded king. The departure of Arthur for Avalon is not merely a death, but a promise of return. The idea of the once and future king is born from this moment. It suggests that Arthur is not truly gone, but merely sleeps, awaiting the day when Britain needs him most. This belief, deeply ingrained in British folklore, offered comfort and hope in times of national crisis, a testament to the profound impact of his legend. Perhaps these waters, shimmering under the pale moonlight, whispered stories of his return to the stars, a secret held by the ancient land itself. The aftermath of Camlann was a period of profound darkness for Britain. The kingdom, already fractured, plunged into further chaos. The ideals of the Round Table, the vision of a just and unified realm, lay shattered on the battlefield, alongside the bodies of its champions. The Saxon invaders, no longer held at bay by Arthur's formidable leadership, pressed their advantage, carving out new kingdoms and pushing the Britons further west. The light of Roman civilization, which Arthur had arguably sought to preserve, finally extinguished, giving way to what historians often refer to as the Dark Ages. The surviving knights, those who had witnessed the fall of their king and the collapse of their world, dispersed. Some sought solace in hermitage, others in exile. Sir Lancelot, who had been absent from the final battle, perhaps due to his own inner turmoil and the consequences of his affair with Guinevere, was left to grapple with the immense guilt of his actions and the loss of his king. His subsequent journey to a monastic life, seeking penance for his sins, is a poignant coda to the tragedy of Camelot. Guinevere, too, retreated from the world, finding sanctuary in a convent, her heart burdened by sorrow and regret. The legacy of Camlann is not just one of loss and destruction, but also of enduring myth. The battle, though devastating, cemented Arthur's place in legend. It provided the necessary tragic ending for a heroic cycle, transforming a powerful leader into a timeless symbol. The image of the fallen king, carried away to a mystical island, awaiting his return, speaks to a universal human desire for hope, for a hero who will rise again in times of dire need. The stories of Camlann, passed down through generations, have varied in their details, each retelling adding new layers of meaning and emotion. From the stark, early Welsh accounts to the richly embellished narratives of Geoffrey of Monmouth and Sir Thomas Malory, the core tragedy remains: the self-destruction of a golden age, brought about by internal strife and the frailties of human nature. The profound sorrow associated with Camlann is palpable in these narratives, a lament for what was lost and what might have been. Even today, the name Camlann evokes a sense of melancholy and grandeur. It is the final, devastating chapter in a story that began with a sword in a stone and a dream of unity. It reminds us that even the greatest of kingdoms can fall, not always from external threats, but often from within, from the seeds of jealousy, ambition, and betrayal. The whispers of the wind across the desolate plains of Camlann, real or imagined, seem to carry the echoes of that final, terrible clash, a lament for the passing of a king and the dawn of an age of shadows. The tragedy of Camlann, therefore, is not just Arthur's, but humanity's, a timeless tale of ambition, loyalty, and the inevitable sorrow that often accompanies the pursuit of ideals. The air, once thick with the clash of steel and the shouts of men, now hung heavy with the silence of a battlefield after the storm. The sun, a weary eye in the bruised sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the fallen. Arthur lay upon the blood-soaked ground, his lifeblood seeping into the earth, staining the very soil he had fought so valiantly to protect. The wound inflicted by Mordred was grievous, a gaping maw that threatened to swallow his very existence. Sir Lucan and Sir Bedivere, two of his most loyal knights, found him there, their hearts heavy with a sorrow that mirrored the twilight descending upon the land. They lifted him gently, their movements slow and deliberate, as if fearing to jostle the last breaths from his body. Every step was an agony for Arthur, each breath a shallow gasp. The clang of their armour, usually a reassuring sound, now seemed a funereal toll. They carried him to a small, desolate chapel nearby, a place of crumbling stone and forgotten prayers, its roof open to the mournful sky. There, in the dim light, Arthur's voice, once a clarion call of command, was but a whisper, barely audible above the rustling of the wind through the broken windows. "Sir Bedivere," he rasped, his eyes clouded with pain, "I pray thee, take my sword, Excalibur, and cast it into the water. And when thou hast done so, return and tell me what thou hast seen." Bedivere, his heart tearing at the thought of parting with such a legendary blade, took Excalibur. Its hilt, adorned with precious jewels, seemed to pulse with a faint, ethereal light, even in the encroaching darkness. He walked to the edge of the nearby lake, its surface a mirror reflecting the sombre sky. He paused, the weight of the sword in his hand feeling immense, not just in its physical mass, but in the history it represented. This was the Sword of Kings, the symbol of Arthur's reign, a blade forged in magic and destiny. To throw it away felt like an act of betrayal, a final surrender. He hid it instead beneath a tree and returned to Arthur. "What sawest thou?" Arthur asked, his voice weaker now. Bedivere, his gaze downcast, replied, "I saw naught but the waving of the reeds and the rippling of the water." A sigh, heavy with disappointment, escaped Arthur's lips. "Thou hast betrayed me for the second time," he murmured, his voice laced with sorrow. "For hadst thou cast it in, some marvel would have appeared. Go again, and spare not, but throw it in." With a heavy heart and a sense of profound shame, Bedivere returned to the lake. This time he hesitated longer, the allure of the sword's beauty and power a strong temptation. He thought of its history, of the battles it had won, of the hopes it had embodied. He hid it again, this time more carefully, and returned to the chapel, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. "What sawest thou?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a breath now. "Sir," Bedivere stammered, I saw naught but the water lapping against the shore. A flicker of anger, quickly extinguished by weariness, crossed Arthur's face. "Ah, traitor, untrue," he whispered, his voice tinged with a deep sadness. "Now hast thou betrayed me twice, but go yet once more, and if thou do as I bid thee, and fail me not, upon my death I will give thee my blessing." Bedivere, his soul racked with guilt, understood the gravity of his king's command. This was not merely about a sword, it was about the completion of a prophecy, the fulfillment of a destiny. He rushed back to the lake, his mind now clear, his resolve firm. He grasped Excalibur, feeling its familiar weight, and with a cry that echoed across the silent water, he hurled it with all his might. The blade, spinning end over end, cut through the air with a whistling sound. As it touched the surface of the lake, a hand, clad in white samite, emerged from the depths. It caught Excalibur by the hilt, held it aloft for a moment, and then drew it back beneath the shimmering surface. The water closed over. Writ without a ripple, as if the sword had never existed. Bedivere, awestruck, returned to Arthur, his voice trembling as he recounted the miraculous sight. Arthur, a faint smile gracing his pale lips, nodded slowly. "Now I may die in peace," he whispered. The legend of Excalibur's return to the Lady of the Lake is one of the most enduring and poignant moments in the Arthurian cycle. It signifies not just the end of Arthur's reign, but the return of magic to its source, a cyclical understanding of power and destiny. This act, described in detail by Sir Thomas Malory in Le Morte d'Arthur, published in 1485, though drawing on much older sources, is a cornerstone of the myth, emphasizing the supernatural elements that surrounded Arthur from his birth to his final moments. Soon after, a barge appeared upon the lake, shrouded in a mystical mist. On board were 3 queens, cloaked in black, their faces veiled, their voices raised in a mournful lament. Among them, some tales say, was Morgan le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, once his adversary, now perhaps, in his final hour, his sorrowful kinswoman. They were figures of ancient power, beings from the other world, come to claim their fallen king. Bedivere, with the last vestiges of his strength, carried Arthur to the barge. He laid him gently upon a bed of soft silk, surrounded by the weeping queens. As the barge began to glide silently across the water, disappearing into the mist, Arthur spoke his final enigmatic words. "Pray for me, Bedivere, for I am going to the Isle of Avalon, the mystical land where all wounds are healed. And if I return, it will be when my country needs me most. The Isle of Avalon. The very name evokes images of ancient magic, of a timeless realm beyond the ken of mortal men. It is a place of healing, of enchantment, a sanctuary where the veil between worlds is thin. In some traditions, Avalon is identified with Glastonbury Tor in Somerset, England, a conical hill crowned by a ruined church tower, often shrouded in mist. The surrounding area, once marshland, would have given the impression of an island. Archaeological excavations at Glastonbury Abbey in the 12th century claim to have discovered the graves of Arthur and Guinevere, further cementing this connection in the popular imagination. However, historians still debate the true location of Avalon, with many viewing it as a purely mythical place, a spiritual rather than a geographical destination. The medieval chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, was instrumental in popularizing the concept of Avalon as Arthur's final resting place, a tradition that became deeply ingrained in the Arthurian narrative. The departure of Arthur to Avalon is not merely an ending, it is a promise. It is the concept of the once and future king, a legend that has resonated through centuries of British history. The idea that Arthur sleeps, awaiting the moment when his people are in dire need, is a powerful symbol of hope and resilience. It suggests that true leadership, courage, and justice are not lost forever, but merely dormant, waiting for the right time to reawaken. This belief provided comfort and inspiration during times of national crisis, particularly in the Middle Ages when England faced internal strife or external threats. The image of Arthur, not dead, but merely resting, became a powerful national myth. The period immediately following Arthur's departure was one of profound sorrow and decline. The Round Table, once the embodiment of chivalry and justice, dissolved. The knights, bereft of their king, scattered, their purpose lost. Guinevere, her heart broken and burdened by guilt, retired to a nunnery, seeking solace and repentance. The golden age of Camelot, that brief, shining moment of idealism and order, faded into memory, replaced by a return to the fractured kingdoms and petty squabbles that had preceded Arthur's reign. The unity he had forged, so hard-won, proved fragile without him. Guiding hand. The legacy of Arthur, however, did not die with his disappearance. It transformed. From a historical figure, perhaps a Romano-British war leader who fought against Saxon invaders in the 5th or 6th century, a detail that remains a scholarly dispute as definitive archaeological or contemporary written evidence is scarce, he evolved into a legendary hero, a cultural icon. The stories of his valor, his wisdom, and his unwavering commitment to justice were passed down through generations, embellished and expanded upon by poets, chroniclers, and storytellers. One lesser-known detail about the aftermath of Arthur's disappearance involves the fate of Sir Bedivere. After laying Arthur on the barge, Bedivere, rather than returning to a life of earthly comfort, chose a path of asceticism. He became a hermit, living a solitary life of prayer and penance in a remote chapel. Dedicating his remaining days to mourning his king and seeking spiritual solace. This act highlights the profound impact Arthur had on his knights, transforming them not just into warriors, but into men of deep loyalty and moral conviction, even in their grief. The tales of Arthur and his knights became a moral compass, a set of ideals against which later generations could measure themselves. Chivalry, courtly love, the quest for the Holy Grail, these concepts, popularized and codified within the Arthurian narratives, shaped the very fabric of medieval European culture. They influenced literature, art, and even the conduct of real-life knights and nobles. The ideals of the Round Table, though never fully realized in practice, offered a vision of a better world, a society founded on honor, courage, and compassion. The story of Arthur's end, his journey to Avalon, is not a tale of defeat, but of transformation. It speaks to the enduring power of myth to transcend historical reality, to capture the human imagination, and to provide meaning and hope across centuries. The mist-shrouded barge, gliding silently towards a mystical island, is a potent image of transition, of the cyclical nature of life and legend. It is a testament to the human need for heroes, for figures who embody our highest aspirations, even if those figures must, for a time, retreat from the world. As the centuries rolled on, the legend of Arthur continued to evolve, adapting to new cultural contexts and reflecting the anxieties and aspirations of each era. During the Tudor period, for instance, King Henry VII, of Welsh descent, actively promoted the Arthurian legend to legitimize his claim to the throne. even naming his first son, Arthur. This demonstrates how deeply the myth was interwoven with national identity and political power. The promise of Arthur's return became a powerful political tool, a symbol of national destiny and continuity. Even in modern times, the allure of Arthur remains undiminished. From literature and film to video games and popular culture, the once and future king continues to capture our imaginations. His story resonates because it grapples with universal themes: the struggle between good and evil, the fragility of idealism, the burden of leadership, the redemptive power of love and sacrifice, and the enduring hope for a better world. The image of the wounded king, carried away to a magical island, waiting for the moment when his country needs him most, is a powerful archetype, a testament to the human spirit's capacity for resilience and renewal. The very ambiguity of Arthur's departure, not death, but a journey to Avalon, leaves open the possibility of his return. It is a narrative choice that imbues the legend with a timeless quality, preventing it from ever truly ending. It allows each generation to reinterpret Arthur's prophecy, to see his potential return in their own struggles and their own hopes for a brighter future. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars, stories of a king who, though gone, was never truly absent, his spirit forever, intertwined with the land he loved, and so the legend sleeps, like Arthur himself, waiting for the dawn. The whispers of Arthur, once confined to the shadowed halls of British bards and the parchment of monastic scribes, began to travel far beyond the misty shores of their origin. As centuries unfurled like ancient tapestries, the tales of Camelot, the Round Table, and the quest for the Holy Grail were not merely preserved. They were reimagined, reinterpreted, and reborn in countless forms, each new iteration adding another shimmering layer to the legend. The sheer adaptability of the Arthurian narrative is perhaps its most profound characteristic, allowing it to resonate across vastly different cultures and historical epochs, a testament to the universal appeal of its core themes. By the High Middle Ages, particularly from the 12th century onward, the Arthurian cycle had become a cornerstone of European literature. French poets, most notably Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century, took the raw, often brutal, Welsh narratives and refined them, infusing them with the courtly love and chivalric ideals that defined the aristocratic culture of their time. Chrétien, whose works include Eric and Enid, Clegess, Lancelot the Knight of the Cart, Yvain the Knight of the Lion, and the unfinished Percival, the Story of the Grail, introduced many of the elements we now consider quintessential Arthurian. He gave us the definitive character of Lancelot, Arthur's greatest knight and the tragic lover of Queen Guinevere, a figure whose internal conflict between loyalty and passion would become central to the legend's enduring emotional power. He also significantly developed the quest for the Holy Grail, transforming it from a mysterious, perhaps even pagan object, into a potent symbol of spiritual purity and divine grace, a quest that only the most virtuous could hope to achieve. These French romances, often written in octosyllabic couplets, spread rapidly across Europe, translated and adapted into German, Dutch, Italian, and Norse. Wolfram von Eschenbach's Percival, written in German around the early 13th century, offered a deeply spiritual and philosophical take on the Grail quest, emphasizing the hero's journey of self-discovery and the importance of compassion. In England, the stories returned home, albeit in a transformed guise. The anonymous poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, composed in the late 14th century in a distinct alliterative style, presented a sophisticated and psychologically complex exploration of chivalry, temptation, and honor, showcasing the enduring moral weight of Arthurian ideals. This poem, discovered centuries later, remains a masterpiece of Middle English literature. Its vivid imagery and intricate plot a testament to the legend's capacity for artistic innovation. However, it was Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, completed around 1469 and printed by William Caxton in 1485, that truly codified the English Arthurian tradition. Malory, writing from prison during the turbulent Wars of the Roses, gathered various French and English sources, weaving them into a sprawling, unified narrative that covered Arthur's birth, his rise to power, the glory of Camelot, the quest for the Grail, and the tragic downfall of the kingdom. Malory's prose, though sometimes stark, possesses a haunting beauty and a profound sense of melancholy, capturing the grandeur and the inevitable sorrow of Arthur's world. His work became the definitive English version of the legend, shaping all subsequent retellings and fixing many of the characters and events in the collective imagination. It was Malory who firmly established the Round Table as a symbol of equality among knights. And it was his narrative that cemented the tragic love triangle of Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere as the central emotional axis of the story. The Renaissance brought new perspectives. While the initial fervour for chivalric romances waned somewhat, the Arthurian legends never entirely faded. Poets like Edmund Spenser, in his epic The Faerie Queene, late 16th century, drew heavily on Arthurian motifs, though he recast Arthur as a figure representing magnificence, a moral virtue, rather than a historical king. Spenser's Arthur is a questing prince, a symbol of English Protestant virtue, demonstrating how the legend could be adapted to serve contemporary political and religious allegories. Even Shakespeare, though not directly writing an Arthurian play, occasionally referenced the legend, acknowledging its pervasive presence in the English consciousness. The 18th century, with its emphasis on reason and classical antiquity, saw a decline in the direct retelling of Arthurian tales, often viewed as superstitious and unsophisticated. Yet, even then, the stories lingered in folk memory and antiquarian interests. The Romantic era of the 19th century, however, witnessed a spectacular resurgence of interest. Poets like Alfred, Lord Tennyson, captivated by Malory's work, penned his monumental Idylls of the King, published between 1859 and 1885. Tennyson's Idylls reimagined the Arthurian cycle as a moral allegory for Victorian England, exploring themes of duty, temptation, and the corrupting influence of passion. His Arthur is a noble, almost Christ-like figure, striving to establish a perfect society against the forces of chaos and human frailty. Tennyson's evocative verse and his focus on the tragic human elements of the story ensured that the legend once again captured the popular imagination. Contemporaneously, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of English painters, poets, and critics, found rich inspiration in the visual and narrative potential of the Arthurian legends. Artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones, and William Morris created stunning works depicting scenes from Camelot. The Grail quest and the tragic figures of Lancelot and Guinevere. Their art, with its lush detail, vibrant colours, and romantic idealism, helped to visually define the Arthurian world for generations, shaping how people imagined the castles, the forests, and the very faces of the legendary characters. Morris, in particular, also contributed to the literary revival with his own Arthurian poetry. The 20th century saw an explosion of Arthurian retellings across various media. T.H. White's The Once and Future King, 1958, a poignant and often humorous reimagining of Malory, became a beloved classic, exploring themes of war, peace, and the nature of power through Arthur's life. White's work, in turn, inspired the popular Broadway musical Camelot, 1960, and its subsequent film adaptation, further embedding a romanticized version of the legend into popular culture. John Steinbeck, a Nobel laureate, also spent considerable time attempting to create a modern English rendition of Malory, though The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights remained unfinished at his death, a testament to the enduring allure and challenge of the material. Fantasy literature, a genre that truly flourished in the 20th century, found a foundational myth in Arthur. Authors like C.S. Lewis, though not directly writing Arthurian tales, drew heavily on the archetypes of noble kings, magical lands, and epic quests that the Arthurian cycle had established. Later fantasy writers, from Marion Zimmer Bradley with her feminist reinterpretation The Mists of Avalon, 1982, to numerous others who have explored various aspects of the legend, have continued to demonstrate its narrative flexibility and its capacity to speak to contemporary concerns. Bradley's work